There has been a tremendous amount of attention over the last 24 hours on the crime issues in Washington, D.C., but it really extends to all of our major American cities. We know that crime over the last few years here in Kansas City has been at historic levels, but of course, D.C. is front and center after President Trump announced the National Guard would be helping out local law enforcement there, and they would be federalizing the Washington, D.C. Police Department. So I wanted to get the perspective from somebody who not only has lived in Washington, D.C., but also grew up here in Kansas City and knows, of course, our community very well. Cassie Smedlie joins us on 95.7 FM. She is the vice president of COIN. She is a former press secretary for the RNC and a D.C. expat and Kansas City native on KCMO. All right, Cassie, so you lived in D.C. for how long after moving there from Kansas City?
Well, I went right after college, so it was 15 years all total working and/or living in D.C. before we just moved out to the suburbs of D.C. in Virginia almost a year ago.
Okay, so what was that thing that said to you, it is time to leave Washington, D.C.?
Yeah. We did a cost-benefit analysis as a family, and simply the costs were too great for too few benefits. It felt like at every turn, the city was working against lawful citizens, taxpayers, to try and make life easier for criminals. I mean, that's what anything from people who got traffic tickets over those who didn't. If you had a license plate that was up to date, chances are you were getting the traffic ticket over the guy behind you who had been parked there for days who had an expired license plate because they couldn't go after that guy. To, of course, crime. They had decriminalized basic crimes, like this shouldn't sound basic, but carjackings, they had lowered the penalty on and made it so that juveniles, that was a big thing that the DC crime or DC gangs have gone after recruiting juveniles during COVID and post-COVID because they could do their dirty work for them and be out in a couple of hours. And the biggest thing that they did around this, and then I'll get more specifically into my family story, was that DC, during COVID, during BLM, they took great lengths to basically neuter the police. The police, if you talk to the local officers who were hanging out in the parks, they were in a reactive posture. They no longer had the ability to proactively patrol, stop crime before it happened, work with community members. We were left organizing our own neighborhood watch patrols. And maybe you had a member of the police who could come out and sort of give you some tips on how to do it. But they didn't have the power to go out and proactively reduce crime or prevent it from happening. And in fact, the city council created many more barriers and regulatory barriers for them to do their job. And so for us, one anecdotal story, we lived in our house in a great neighborhood, seemingly great neighborhood, brought home both of our babies to that house. And I had a neighbor who had lived on the street for decades, and she would see me it was winter, so 5:30, 6 o'clock, rush hour, but dark out. And she'd say, "Can you call me or text me when you're on your way home so I can go out on my porch and watch you get the babies out of the car? I'm so nervous you're going to get carjacked while you're getting into your house." And I thought, that's a really nice neighborly thing to offer, but that's not normal. That's not how we should be living. And yet it was really up to us to work amongst ourselves to care for each other because the DC City Council certainly wasn't doing it.
So you're paying tremendous amount in taxes. The cost of living in D.C. is arguably higher than anywhere else in the nation at this point. And you've got neighbors saying, hey, text me when you get home so I can make sure you don't get carjacked as you're taking your young children out of the vehicle. I mean, I would say that conversation right there, Cassie, is a great reason to say, I'm out, I'm done. Was that like the final nail in the coffin for you, or was there something else?
That was the one that really stuck in our minds as, I don't think this is a great place for us to raise our kids right now. Certainly we were looking for a place with a little more elbow room, but that, one of your most active text chains is your parent friends who are checking in on each other when the latest crime alert text goes out. That's just something that weighs on you after a while. But I have to say, Pete, it wasn't always this way. Pre-COVID, DC, it's got great restaurants and great happy hours and, of course, bolstered by staff on Capitol Hill and downtown, it was really bustling. And you could go on a run on the National Mall at dusk without your phone and feel pretty good about it. You know, you were smart about it. You checked in with your friends, made sure somebody knew where you were, but that you'd do anywhere. And then during COVID and when the BLM riots happened, there was really a change where they made decisions that favored those who were not law-abiding and who did not have any pride in our city over those who did. And you might remember, it was, I think, 2023, the D.C. City Council passed a resolution that would have effectively defunded the police, neutered them, and put up more regulations on them. And Mayor Bowser vetoed it, and they overrode her veto, so much so that Congress had to get involved, and they overrode the council in bipartisan support. So all of this that you're hearing from liberals, that this isn't real, Trump's overplaying his hand because he wants to be a dictator and crime is fine. I mean, Congress rarely does anything notable. They work in bipartisan ways on less headline-making bills, but they rarely have headline-making legislation passed in a huge bipartisan fashion. And they did that in this case. And if you ever want to just peruse C-SPAN, you can go back and watch the debate on the bill. It was very pro-police. It was very much centered on DC having prioritized, like I said, or deprioritized police, prioritized criminals, and we are suffering the consequences of that. And even members of Congress have been carjacked in neighborhoods that are half a mile away from the Capitol. This isn't like, oh, it's just happening in a couple bad neighborhoods.
So Cassie Smedlie's here. She is a Kansas City native. She's been in D.C. for 15 years, vice president of COIN, former RNC press secretary. So Congress on a bipartisan basis overrode the D.C. City Council a couple of years ago to basically make sure the police were properly funded. Like, I'd be curious to know where Emmanuel Cleaver, you well know, Kansas City congressman, represents your family members here in the Kansas City area. He was ragging yesterday on the president, and he said here on social media, crime hit a 30-year low in Washington last year. Crime's down 26% this year. The president should focus on lowering costs for American families. First off, I heard that 30-year low thing, Cassie, but I looked at FBI charts that shows it's down from its peak in 23, but where's this 30-year low number coming from? I can't figure this out.
Right. They're clamoring on to a stat that fits their narrative. But you're right. I think if you go to, it was at record highs or near record highs at, I think, 35 years before that. But two factors to keep in mind here when they're talking about this 30-year low, two things that make me skeptical of that number, which I'm not finding that number. I'm finding the FBI stat you talked about. But two things to be skeptical of. One of the police commissioners in one of the police districts is he's suspended right now for manipulating the crime data in favor of lower statistics. And two, they've gone so far out of their way to lower the penalties or lower the classifications for crimes, not because they aren't happening anymore, but because there's so many of them and the courts are so overwhelmed that they can't process all of them. So they lowered the classifications. Criminals is broken windows there. Criminals figured that out. And so now they exploit those crimes. And thank goodness for Judge Janine Pirro, who now, as you know, is in the district court in D.C. She's going to get her arms around this. And this is one of the things that she's going to try and right side that they have, that I believe is one of the contributing factors to why you have all of this crime. I mean, D.C. still has more homicides than Baltimore. Baltimore is pretty much synonymous with being a dangerous city. D.C. is more dangerous than Baltimore. Just FYI, whatever crime stat you want to throw out, it's more dangerous than Baltimore. You heard yesterday from the White House, more dangerous than Bogota. And yes, it's a big city. Crime happens. I think people come to the city with a reasonable expectation that you need to be smart. But it is not how it's always been. And I still have family and many good friends who are still living in D.C. because they've chosen that route for their family and it's the right match for their family. And they deserve to have a safe city again. And as you pointed out, it's one of the most expensive cities in the country. For all of those taxes that you're paying, you should not only have safety, but have good roads, have sidewalks where you can push your stroller down the sidewalk and not worry about knocking your tire off kilter. I mean, these are things that you would expect in any city where the taxes are that high, but particularly our nation's capital. People should feel comfortable coming to their House of Representatives, coming to see the People's House at the White House, feel safe, but also just enjoy walking around, feel like it's a nice place to be. And for too long, the city council has been making decisions that have unfortunately caused the city to look like a shell of its former self in some areas.
Yeah. Well, Cassie, we're glad that you're doing well. You're out of Washington, D.C., and it's always great to have you back on KCMO. Thanks so much for the time and the insight.
Thanks for having me, Pete. Have a good one.
You as well. Cassie Smedlie, she is the vice president of COIN, former RNC press secretary, and a Kansas City native who recently moved out of Washington, D.C. in the wake of that big news yesterday. I think Emanuel Cleaver and some of these other folks are scared to death that, a law and order approach actually kicks butt in D.C., and that will just blow up the entire narrative of the last few years that somehow softer on crime policies, fewer police, if we just got a couple of, therapists involved to go door to door, we'd be much better off. And that is their biggest nightmare in all this, John.
I like the way Trump reimagines law enforcement, I think.
Yeah, I do too. Mm-hmm. I like his style a lot better. And it's going to work. That's the other thing. It's going to work. There's no doubt in my mind about that. They'll have success. And the second they have success, that's not good for Emanuel Cleaver. That's why he's ragging on this thing yesterday. It's like, what? Why is Cleaver bothering? By the way, when's the last time Cleaver ragged on the Kansas City crime rate? We had a record number of homicides 2 years ago. Did Cleaver say anything about that? He was the mayor here. He's got a road named after him, for crying out loud. He's got more to say about what Trump's doing in D.C. than he does, what's going on here in his hometown. Yes, he's playing politics. So is Trump, by the way. Trump's playing politics. There's no doubt about it. Trump's playing politics here. I'm not denying that for a second. But I'll tell you what, the idea that we're going to have a federal government that helps solve the crime rate and the notion that somehow this is like dictator level stuff, I'm telling you, this is just not going to connect with regular people like they think it will. People want lower costs and they want to feel relatively safe. That's really like 1-2. It's simple.